October 16, 1940. Dawn breaks cold and gray over Warsaw. The air smells of damp brick and coal smoke. In the narrow streets of the Naluki district, wooden carts clatter over cobblestones. A child's shoe lies abandoned in the gutter, its leather cracked and sole worn through. By noon, German soldiers in Feldgrau uniforms will begin hammering notices onto doorways, each poster bearing the Black Eagle of the Reich and words that will seal the fate of nearly 500,000 souls. The walls are going up, 3 meters high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. The largest ghetto in occupied Europe is about to close its gates, and those trapped inside do not yet know they are living in a prelude to annihilation. This is not a story about war in the traditional sense. There are no grand tank battles here, no aerial dogfights, no strategic mountaintops to capture. This is a story about the slow, methodical erasure of human beings, carried out in the heart of a European capital while the world turned its gaze elsewhere. It is a story about 450,000 people compressed into 1.3 square miles, starved, diseased, worked to death, and ultimately murdered. It is also a story about 2 men in SS black who orchestrated this machinery of death, and who, in the end, stood before justice with nooses around their necks. But before we reach that moment of reckoning, we must understand what happened inside those walls, and why this place became a synonym for hell on earth. Warsaw before the war was a city of light and culture. The Jewish quarter hummed with life, rabbinical schools, theaters, publishing houses, cafes where intellectuals debated philosophy over glasses of tea. Jewish Warsaw was not separate from Polish Warsaw. It was woven into its fabric. Jewish doctors treated Polish patients. Jewish musicians performed in Polish concert halls. Jewish merchants kept shops along the royal way. They were lawyers, teachers, tailors, scholars. They were Poles who happened to be Jews, and Jews who happened to be Poles. In 1939, Warsaw's Jewish population numbered approximately 375,000, nearly 30% of the city's inhabitants. They spoke Yiddish and Polish and Hebrew. They were Orthodox and secular, wealthy and poor, Zionist and socialist. They were, in short, human beings living ordinary lives. Then came September 1st, 1939. The Wehrmacht rolled across the Polish border with 1.5 million men, 2,750 tanks, and 2,315 aircraft. The Luftwaffe bombed Warsaw for 27 consecutive days. By September 28th, the city had surrendered. Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign nation, carved up between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia like a carcass divided between wolves. And for the Jews of Warsaw, the nightmare began not with a sudden blow, but with 1,000 small cuts, each one designed to dehumanize, to isolate, to prepare the ground for something far worse. First came the decrees. Jews must wear white armbands with a blue Star of David. Jews cannot use public transportation. Jews cannot own radios. Jews cannot attend schools with Aryan children. Jews cannot walk on certain streets. Jews cannot sit on park benches. Each regulation arrived with bureaucratic precision, stamped and signed and posted on official letterhead, as if legality could sanitize cruelty. The German occupiers did not present themselves as monsters. They presented themselves as administrators, men carrying out the orderly implementation of racial policy. They kept meticulous records. They typed reports in triplicate. They filed everything properly. Evil, it turned out, wore a tie and carried a clipboard. By October 1940, SS Brigadefuhrer Jürgen Stroop and SS Gruppenführer Ferdinand von Samron-Franknecht had arrived in Warsaw as part of the occupation command structure. These were not crude street thugs elevated by circumstance. Stroop was a former clerk turned police officer, a man who had joined the Nazi Party in 1932 and risen through the ranks of the SS with methodical ambition. He was 45 years old, balding, with a square jaw and cold eyes. He believed in the ideology completely. For him, Jews were not people but problems, obstacles to be removed in service of a greater racial vision. Von Samron-Franknecht was older, an Austrian aristocrat with a military background, a man who wrapped his brutality in the language of duty and discipline. Both men would later claim they were simply following orders, as if moral responsibility could be outsourced to a chain of command. The walls went up in stages throughout the autumn of 1940. German soldiers and forced Jewish labor crews built them from brick and stone, 11.5 miles of barrier cutting through the city like a surgical incision. The ghetto encompassed the old Jewish quarter and parts of the surrounding neighborhoods, but it was a fraction of the space that had housed the Jewish population before the war. And now, into this compressed area, the Germans began forcing not only Warsaw's Jews, but also tens of thousands more deported from surrounding towns and villages. By early 1941, approximately 450,000 people were trapped inside the Warsaw Ghetto. The population density reached an unimaginable level, 7 to 8 people per room. Families lived in single apartments with 3 or 4 other families. Privacy became a memory. Dignity became a luxury no one could afford. What did the Germans expect would happen? The answer lies in their plans, meticulously documented in the archives of the general government. They expected starvation. They expected disease. They expected death on a mass scale. The official German food allocation for Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto was 184 calories per day, less than 10% of what a human being needs to survive. Compare this to the 699 calories allocated to Poles, or the 2,613 calories allocated to Germans living in occupied Poland. The message was clear: Jews were to be slowly starved to death. "The Jews will die from hunger and destitution," wrote one German official in an internal memo, "and a cemetery will remain of the Jewish question." This was not accidental neglect. This was policy. This was murder by arithmetic. But what the Germans did not expect was resilience. They did not expect that within those walls, people would fight to preserve not just their lives, but their humanity. They did not anticipate the schools that would be organized in secret apartments, where children learned mathematics and history and literature despite the prohibition on Jewish education. They did not foresee the concerts performed in hidden courtyards, where musicians played Chopin and Mendelssohn with instruments smuggled past German guards. They did not imagine the libraries maintained by volunteers, the poetry written on scraps of paper, the weddings conducted under tattered prayer shawls. The ghetto residents understood that the Germans wanted to strip them of their humanity before stripping them of their lives. And so they resisted in the most profound way possible. They insisted on remaining human. A loaf of bread became the symbol of everything. In the ghetto, bread was currency, hope, survival, and heartbreak all at once. The official ration provided less than 1 loaf per person per week, and even that often failed to arrive. Mothers cut their own portions to feed their children. Fathers traded heirloom watches for half a loaf on the black market. Children as young as 6 or 7 became smugglers, slipping through holes in the wall or gaps in the wire, risking their lives to bring back a few potatoes or a bag of flour. Some of these child smugglers were shot by German guards. Their small bodies were left in the streets as warnings. Yet others continued, because the alternative was watching their families starve. Bread was not just food, it was the measure of how much of yourself you were willing to give up to keep another alive. By the summer of 1941, people were dying in the streets at a rate of hundreds per day. Typhus swept through the ghetto in waves, aided by the overcrowding and the lack of sanitation. Corpses lay on the sidewalks, covered with newspapers, waiting for the burial carts that could not keep pace with the dying. The dead were stripped of their clothes before burial, because cloth had value and the dead had none. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs begged at corners. Old men collapsed mid-step and were stepped over by crowds too exhausted to stop. The ghetto became a vision of what happens when human beings are systematically denied the basic requirements of life: food, water, medicine, space, dignity. It became a laboratory for cruelty, and the Germans documented it all with photographs and reports, clinical observations of a population being murdered in slow motion. Yet even in this hell, networks of resistance began to form. The Jewish combat organization, the Zydowska Organizacja, or OB, was founded in July 1942 by young activists from Zionist and socialist movements. They were led by men and women in their 20s, Mordecai Anielewicz, Zivia Lebetkin, Marek Edelman, who understood that armed resistance was likely futile but necessary. They smuggled weapons into the ghetto: pistols, grenades, homemade explosives. They built bunkers beneath buildings and trained in secret. They knew the Germans were preparing something worse than starvation. Rumors had reached the ghetto of camps in the east where Jews were being murdered by the thousands. Names like Treblinka and Sobibor whispered through the streets like curses. The resistance fighters decided that if death was inevitable, they would choose how they met it. They would die with weapons in their hands. In July 1942, the Germans began what they called the Great Action. SS and police units, aided by Ukrainian and Lithuanian auxiliaries, surrounded blocks of the ghetto and ordered the residents to assemble at the Umschlagplatz, the deportation square adjacent to the railway tracks. The Germans announced that Jews were being resettled to labor camps in the east. Most people did not believe the lie, but what choice did they have? German soldiers went building to building, dragging families into the streets. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. The elderly and the sick were shot where they lay. At the Umschlagplatz, people were packed into cattle cars, 100 or more per car, with no food, no water, no sanitation. The trains traveled 60 miles northeast to Treblinka, where upon arrival, the passengers were stripped naked, driven into gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, and murdered with carbon monoxide from diesel engines. The entire process from arrival to death took less than 2 hours. By September 1942, the Germans had deported approximately 265,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. Nearly all of them were dead within days of their deportation. Back in the ghetto, the population had been reduced from 450,000 to fewer than 60,000. Those who remained knew the truth. There was no resettlement. There were no labor camps. There was only death. And so, when the Germans returned on April 19, 1943, to liquidate the ghetto once and for all, they encountered something they had not expected: armed resistance. The date was chosen deliberately by the Germans. April 19th was the eve of Passover, the Jewish holiday commemorating liberation from slavery in Egypt. The SS expected to find a demoralized, starving population, easy to round up and deport. Instead, when columns of German soldiers and police entered the ghetto at dawn, they were met with gunfire and explosions. The OB and another resistance group, the Jewish Military Union, had prepared ambush positions throughout the ghetto. Fighters threw Molotov cocktails from upper-story windows. They detonated mines beneath German formations. They shot at officers from hidden positions. The initial German assault was repelled. For the first time in occupied Europe, an organized Jewish armed resistance had forced German forces to retreat. Jürgen Stroop was given command of the operation to crush the uprising. He brought in reinforcements, over 2,000 soldiers including SS, Wehrmacht, and auxiliary police units. He had artillery, flamethrowers, and air support. The Jewish fighters numbered fewer than 750, armed with perhaps 2 or 3 dozen rifles, a few hundred pistols, and homemade explosives. The outcome was never in doubt, but the manner of it was. Stroop decided that if the Jews would not come out, he would burn them out. He ordered his men to set fire to the ghetto block by block. Buildings were doused with gasoline and ignited. Families hiding in bunkers were suffocated by smoke or burned alive. Those who emerged were shot or captured and sent to Treblinka or Majdanek. The ghetto became an inferno. Smoke rose over Warsaw in black columns, visible across the city. Poles on the Aryan side of the wall watched the flames and heard the gunfire and did nothing or could do nothing or chose to do nothing. The reasons varied, and none of them mattered to the people dying inside. The battle lasted 28 days. The Germans fought with overwhelming force against an enemy that had no chance of military victory, and knew it. The Jews fought not to win but to resist, to deny the Germans an easy slaughter, to prove that they had not gone meekly. On May 8th, the command bunker of the OB at 18 Mila Street was discovered and surrounded. Rather than surrender, Mordecai Anielewicz and many of his fighters committed suicide with poison or shot themselves. On May 16th, Stroop declared the operation complete. To mark the occasion, he ordered the destruction of the Great Synagogue on Tolmaki Street, one of the largest in Europe, located outside the ghetto in the Aryan district. The explosion was symbolic. Judaism itself was being erased from Warsaw. Stroop sent a report to his superiors with the title, "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw is no more." He included a leather-bound album of photographs documenting the operation, including images of families being pulled from bunkers, of women and children with their hands raised, of buildings in flames. He was proud of his work. He expected commendation. Approximately 13,000 Jews were killed during the uprising and its suppression. Another 50,000 were deported to death camps or concentration camps. By the summer of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto was rubble and ash. The Germans systematically demolished what remained of the buildings, leveling entire blocks. They wanted no monument to remain, no evidence that hundreds of thousands of people had lived and died there. They wanted amnesia, enforced through dynamite and bulldozers. But history does not forget. Evidence survived. Survivors survived. And among those survivors was a woman named Rachel Auerbach, who had worked in a soup kitchen in the ghetto and documented everything she witnessed. She was one of the few who managed to escape during the uprising. After the war, she became a historian of the Holocaust, dedicating her life to ensuring that the world would know what happened in Warsaw. Others survived as well, scattered across the world, carrying memories that weighed more than any physical burden. They testified. They wrote memoirs. They haunted the sleep of those who had tried to erase them. As for Jürgen Stroop and Ferdinand von Samron-Franknecht, their fates diverged. Von Samron-Franknecht was removed from command before the uprising because Himmler deemed him insufficiently ruthless. He was reassigned to the Balkans, where he continued to participate in anti-partisan operations. In September 1944, he was captured by Yugoslav partisans near Zagreb. They did not afford him the courtesy of a trial. He was executed by firing squad. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. Stroop's end took longer, but was no less certain. After the Warsaw operation, he was promoted and assigned to anti-partisan duties in Greece. He survived the war and went into hiding under a false name in the Bavarian countryside. He was arrested by American forces in March 1946. Extradition requests came from both Poland and West Germany. Poland wanted him for the destruction of the ghetto. Germany wanted him for the execution of American prisoners of war. Poland's claim took precedence. In July 1951, Jürgen Stroop stood trial in Warsaw before a Polish court. He was charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not least his own report, that leather-bound album of horror he had compiled with such bureaucratic pride. Throughout the trial, Stroop maintained that he had been following orders. He expressed no remorse. He referred to the ghetto residents as bandits and subhumans. He seemed genuinely baffled that he was being held accountable for actions he considered legitimate acts of war. On September 23, 1951, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He appealed. The appeal was denied. On March 6, 1952, at Mokoto prison in Warsaw, Jürgen Stroop was hanged. He was 57 years old. His final words, if he had any, were not recorded. The man who had overseen the murder of hundreds of thousands died at the end of a rope, his name forever synonymous with atrocity. The loaf of bread, that symbol of survival and sacrifice within the ghetto, took on a different meaning after the war. Survivors spoke of how they could never again take food for granted, how the sight of a full table could bring them to tears, how they saved bread in drawers and pockets long after the need had passed. The trauma of starvation does not end when the food arrives. It lives in the body, in the instincts, in the involuntary hoarding of crumbs. Bread became a testament not just to what was lost, but to what it means to lose the certainty that you will eat tomorrow. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising did not save the Jews of Warsaw. By the time the smoke cleared, they were already dead or deported. But it did something else. It shattered the myth of Jewish passivity. It forced the world to acknowledge that resistance occurred, that people fought back, that the narrative of victims going quietly to their deaths was incomplete and unjust. The uprising became a symbol for Jewish resilience and defiance, commemorated every year on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Monuments were built. Trees were planted. Names were carved into stone. The Germans tried to erase the ghetto from the map, but memory proved stronger than dynamite. In the decades after the war, historians sifted through the ruins, both literal and metaphorical, of the Warsaw Ghetto. They found diaries buried in milk cans, hidden beneath buildings that no longer existed. They found testimony from survivors who had been children in the ghetto and were now grandparents. They found German documents, archived and cataloged with typical German thoroughness, documenting every deportation, every execution, every ton of barbed wire and brick used to build the walls. The evidence formed a mosaic of horror, but also of humanity. People had loved in the ghetto. They had married, given birth, celebrated holidays, told jokes, sung songs, argued about politics and God and the meaning of suffering. They had lived fully even as they were being murdered slowly. The question that haunts is not whether the Germans were capable of such evil. History has answered that definitively. The question is what allowed it to happen, what structures of thought and society made it possible for ordinary men to become executioners, for bureaucrats to administrate genocide, for neighbors to watch as their neighbors were loaded onto trains and driven away. The answer is complex and uncomfortable. It involves ideology, certainly, the poisonous belief in racial hierarchy, in the superiority of one people and the worthlessness of another. But it also involves obedience, conformity, careerism, indifference. It involves the willingness to look away, to believe convenient lies, to prioritize personal safety over moral duty. The Holocaust was not perpetrated by a few monsters. It was perpetrated by thousands of ordinary people who made small compromises, told themselves they had no choice, and kept their heads down while the world burned. And what of the 2 SS generals hanged for their crimes? Were their deaths justice? Survivors held different views. Some found solace in the knowledge that the perpetrators faced consequences, that the arc of history, however slowly, bent toward accountability. Others felt that no punishment could balance the scales, that a single death could not atone for 450,000. Justice in such cases is always inadequate. The dead remain dead. The trauma remains. But the trials and executions served a purpose beyond vengeance. They established a precedent. They affirmed that there are actions beyond the protection of following orders, that individuals bear moral responsibility for their choices, that the law can reach even those who thought themselves above it. The ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto are now covered by modern buildings, apartments, and offices. Only fragments of the wall remain, preserved as memorials. Plaques mark sites of significance: the Umschlagplatz, the Mila 18 bunker, the monument to the ghetto heroes. Visitors come from around the world to walk these streets and try to imagine what stood here before. It is difficult. The past has been paved over. But beneath the pavement, history lingers. Archaeologists occasionally uncover artifacts: buttons, coins, fragments of pottery, the detritus of lives interrupted. Each object is a small resurrection, a refusal to be forgotten. There is a Yiddish word, shoah, which means catastrophe or destruction. It is the word many survivors use to describe what happened because Holocaust, derived from Greek, implies a sacrifice, and there was nothing sacrificial about the murder of 6 million Jews. The Shoah was not an offering to any god. It was the consequence of hatred systematized, of bureaucracy weaponized, of indifference normalized. And the Warsaw Ghetto stands as the most concentrated, documented example of that process. Within its walls, we see the entire machinery of the Holocaust in miniature: ghettoization, starvation, disease, deportation, extermination. We also see resistance, solidarity, courage, and the stubborn persistence of human dignity in the face of annihilation. The bread, that recurring symbol, reminds us that survival is measured in the smallest increments. A crust of bread could mean another day of life. A half loaf could mean hope. A full loaf could mean a chance to help someone else survive. After the war, many survivors became obsessive about food, about making sure there was always enough, about never wasting a crumb. Their children grew up hearing "finish your plate," not as a parental cliché, but as a commandment forged in famine. The trauma traveled across generations, encoded in habits and anxieties that grandchildren still carry without fully understanding why. The story of the Warsaw Ghetto is not only about the past. It is about the fragility of civilization, about how quickly the veneer of humanity can be stripped away when we devalue the lives of others. It is a warning about the dangers of demonizing entire groups, of reducing people to labels, of allowing prejudice to harden into policy. The Germans who built the ghetto did not see Jews as individuals with names and families and dreams. They saw statistics, problems, obstacles. Dehumanization was the necessary precondition for genocide. Once you convince yourself that another human being is less than human, there is no limit to the cruelty you can justify. And yet the story is also about the capacity of human beings to resist even in impossible circumstances, to choose solidarity over self-preservation, to fight not because victory is possible, but because surrender is unthinkable. The fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising knew they would die. They fought anyway. The teachers who ran secret schools knew they risked execution. They taught anyway. The archivists who buried diaries and documents in the ghetto knew they might never be found. They preserved them anyway. These acts of defiance, large and small, were assertions of agency in a system designed to strip it away. They were declarations that the Germans could take their lives, but not their humanity. In the end, 450,000 lives were lost in the Warsaw Ghetto. Each one was a universe of experience, memory, love, and potential. Each one mattered. To reduce them to a statistic is to complete the work the Nazis began. So we speak their names when we can. We tell their stories. We remember the child whose shoe lay in the gutter on that October morning in 1940. We remember the mother who divided her bread. We remember the young fighter who threw a Molotov cocktail at a tank. We remember the old man who died reciting prayers. We remember the teacher, the doctor, the musician, the merchant. We remember that they lived, and how they died, and who killed them. Jürgen Stroop and Ferdinand von Sammeln-Franknecht were hanged for their crimes, and that is a small, insufficient chapter in a story that demands more than legal accountability. It demands that we internalize the lessons, that we recognize the early warning signs when they appear again, and they do appear in different forms in different places. The demonization of minorities, the rhetoric of us versus them, the gradual erosion of rights disguised as security measures, the normalization of cruelty. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and those who know the cadence of the Warsaw Ghetto can hear the echoes when they begin. The walls of the ghetto are gone, demolished by the Germans in their furious attempt to erase evidence, and later built over by a city rebuilding itself from ruins. But walls are not only physical. They exist in the mind, in the borders we draw between ourselves and others, in the categories we use to decide who deserves compassion and who does not. The Warsaw Ghetto teaches us that those walls, once erected, become instruments of death. And it teaches us that tearing them down, refusing to accept the logic of separation and dehumanization, is the essential work of remaining human. The loaf of bread, passed from hand to hand in the ghetto, was more than sustenance. It was a statement of faith, that tomorrow might come, that sharing was still possible, that even in hell, we remain responsible for one another. That lesson endures. It must endure. Because the alternative is to forget, and forgetting is the final genocide, the one we inflict upon ourselves when we allow the dead to disappear without a trace, when we permit the past to be sanitized and softened and stripped of its power to warn us. So we remember the walls. We remember the 450,000. We remember the 2 generals who hanged for their crimes and the countless others who escaped justice, and the systems that enabled them all. We remember not out of a morbid obsession with suffering, but because memory is the only bridge between the dead and the living, the only way the murdered can still speak. They speak through survivors' testimony. They speak through buried diaries. They speak through the fragments of wall preserved as memorials. They speak through the absence itself, the empty spaces where families and communities once thrived. And they ask us, across the decades, a single question: what will you do when the walls begin to rise again? The answer to that question is not historical, is immediate, personal, urgent. It lives in the choices we make every day about how we treat others, about what we tolerate, about where we draw the line. The Warsaw Ghetto is not safely in the past, is a possibility that exists wherever human beings decide that some lives matter less than others. The only thing standing between civilization and barbarity is the collective decision to remember, to care, to refuse the easy comforts of indifference. And so the story ends not with the liberation of the ghetto, because there was no liberation, only destruction, but with a call to vigilance. The walls can always go up again. The trains can always start running. The bureaucrats can always find justifications. The only defense is memory, the stubborn insistence that we will not forget, that we will not allow the dead to vanish into unmarked graves and official amnesia. In Warsaw, on the site of the former ghetto, flowers are still laid at memorials. Candles are still lit. Names are still read aloud. The dead are heavy, but we carry them anyway, because that is the burden and the privilege of survival. We carry them not as a weight that crushes us, but as a responsibility that defines us. We carry them because they cannot carry themselves. We carry them because memory, in the end, is the only immortality we can offer, the only way to defy the finality of death and the ambitions of murderers. The bread has long since been eaten or turned to dust. The walls have fallen. The generals have hanged. But the story lives, passed from generation to generation, like a sacred text, like a warning written in blood and ash. And as long as we tell it, as long as we refuse to look away, as long as we insist that 450,000 lives mattered, and that their murder demands an answer from us all, then the walls of oblivion will not have the final word. Memory will. Truth will. And in that persistence of remembrance, the dead find their voice, and we find our duty. The Warsaw Ghetto was hell on earth, but it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic annihilation. In the choice between despair and resistance, between silence and testimony, between forgetting and remembering, we honor the dead by choosing the harder path, the one that demands we look directly at the horror and refuse to turn away. That is the legacy of the ghetto. That is the meaning of 450,000 lives lost. That is why we remember, and why we must never stop remembering, as long as walls can be built and trains can run and human beings can convince themselves that other human beings are less than human. In the end, we are all standing at the Umschlagplatz, waiting to see whether we will be the ones who board the trains, or the ones who watch them depart, or the ones who fight to derail them. The choice is not historical. It is now. It is always now. And the dead are watching, waiting to see what we will do with the freedom they were denied, the bread they starved for, the life they fought to preserve against impossible odds. Remember the walls. Remember the 450,000. Remember that they were people, not numbers. Remember that it happened. Remember that it can happen again. And remember that the only answer to the machinery of death is the insistence on life, on dignity, on the radical proposition that every human being matters, that every life is irreplaceable, that the bread we break and share is sacred, and that the walls we build to divide ourselves are always, in the end, the walls of our own imprisonment. The Warsaw Ghetto is gone, but its lessons remain, carved into the conscience of humanity like scars that will not fade. And in those scars we find not only grief but purpose, not only memory but mission. To ensure that never again means never again. To ensure that the dead did not die for nothing. To ensure that we, the living, prove worthy of the survival they were denied. That is the final accounting. That is the epilogue that never ends. That is the burden we carry forward generation after generation, until the last survivor is gone and only history remains. And even then, especially then, we must tell the story. We must speak the names. We must light the candles. We must remember the bread and the walls and the 450,000 souls who lived and loved and suffered and died in the heart of Warsaw, while the world watched or looked away. We remember, and in remembering, we resist the final oblivion. We insist that they lived. We insist that it mattered. We insist that we have learned, that we will do better, that we will not allow the walls to rise again without a fight. That is the promise we make to the dead. That is the duty we owe the future. That is the meaning of the Warsaw Ghetto, 70 years gone, but forever present, forever demanding an answer to the simplest and most difficult question of all. What will you do when evil is systematic, when cruelty is legal, when death is bureaucratic, and when the walls begin to close in? The answer echoes across the decades, written in bread and blood and ash. We will remember. We will resist. We will remain human. And we will never, ever forget.